What's up, everybody? I'm Zombie Cat,
And I'm Skull.
and this is the Horror Den. We are back today with another creepypasta called A Shattered Life. This is on creepypasta.com, written by Matt Demirsky. Sorry if we mispronounced that. It's a pretty quick story. It was posted in 2020. I never read it, but I listened to it, and I remember it being really cool. So, yeah.
Like always, I have no idea what I'm getting into. If I had to make a guess just by the tags that I'm seeing, which are spoiler free, my guess is that somebody's life is messed up and they somehow discover a way to time travel and they try to fix their mistakes. That's my best guess. So informative. Anyway, so before we get into it, just wanted to mention just some quick things. If you want to, support us in any kind of way, you can head over to Instagram and follow us there at the Horden channel. And we also have a Patreon, which our lovely editor will put in. You can subscribe for as low as $5 a month. And we're already working on some new ideas to make some membership stuff there. More willing, something that people would maybe want to see. So, if you are interested in that, just go ahead and go over to there. But if not, we understand. We're going to go ahead and get into it.
Like what you see today, be sure to leave a like and subscribe.
Yeah. Now, without further ado, let's get into A Shattered Life. Before we begin, we have announced it in the last video, but we're going to go ahead and just retell you about it before you get into the story here. But we are, in a couple weeks, we are starting up our first annual Horror Havoc here at the Horror Den. We have 8 videos planned, coming out 2 a week through the month of October. Of course, that is always pending because we all work full-time jobs, and so does our editor, and this is a very big workload on him. So, be gentle with us this go around.
Just in case, worst case scenario, there might be a video or two that gets posted a little after October.
Right.
Worst case, but our plan is for the final video to be up on Halloween.
Correct. Which
Halloween night.
Really excited about that one. But all right, guys, without further ado, let's get into it.
I don't know when you're going to read this, but I can tell you when it started. I was out for a walk, alone in the woods, when the entity came for me. It was beyond a blur. It was, for lack of a better term, absence of meaning. Where it hid, there were no trees. Where it crept closer, there were no grass. Through the arc, it leapt at me. There was no breeze of motion. There was no air at all. As it struck, I felt the distinct sensation of claws puncturing me somewhere unseen, somewhere I'd never felt before. My hands and arms and legs and torso seemed fine, and I wasn't bleeding, but I knew I'd been injured somehow. As I fearfully ran back home, I could tell that I was vaguely tired, and it was hard to focus at times. The solution at that early stage was easy. A big cup of coffee helped me feel normal again. For a while, that subtle drain on my spirit became lost in the ebb and flow of caffeine in my system. You could say my life began that week, actually, because that was when I met Mar. She and I got along great. Though, to be honest, I'm pretty sure I fell in love with her over the phone before we even met. It was almost as if the strong emotions of that first week made the entity fight back. It was still with me, latched on to some invisible part of my being. The first few incidents were minor, and I hardly worried about them. The color of a neighbor's car changed from dark blue to black one morning, and I stared at it before shaking my head and shrugging off the difference. 2 days later, at work, a coworker's name changed from Fred to Dan. I carefully asked around, but everyone said his name had always been Dan. I figured I'd just been mistaken. Then, as ridiculous as this sounds, I was peeing in my bathroom at home when I suddenly found myself on a random street. I was still in my pajamas, pants down and urinating, but now in full view of a dozen people at a bus stop. Horrified, I pulled up my clothes and ran before someone called the cops. I did manage to get home, but the experience forced me to admit that I was still in danger. The entity was doing something to me. I didn't understand how to fight back.
Mar showed up that evening, but she had her own key. "Hey," I asked with confusion. "How'd you get a key?" She just laughed. "You're cute. Are you sure you're okay with this?" She opened a door and entered a room full of boxes. I know living together is a big step, especially when we've only been dating for 3 months. Living together? I'd literally just met her the week before. Thing was, my mother had always called me a smart cookie for a reason. I knew when to shut my yap instead of causing a scene. I told her everything was fine, and then I went straight to my room and began investigating. My things were just as I had left them, with no sign of a 3-month gap in habitation, but I did find something out of the ordinary. The date. I shivered angrily as I processed the truth. The entity had eaten 3 months of my life. What the hell was I facing? What kind of creature could consume pieces of one's soul like that? I'd missed the most exciting part of a new relationship, and I would never understand any shared stories or in-jokes from that period. Something absurdly precious had been taken from me, and I was furious. That fury helped suppress the entity. I never imbibed alcohol, I drank coffee religiously, I checked the date every time I woke up. For 3 years I managed to live each day while observing nothing more than minor alterations. A social fact here and there, someone's job, how many kids they had, that sort of thing. The layout of nearby streets, the time my favorite television show aired, that kind of thing. Always, those changes reminded me the creature still had its claws sunk into my spirit. Not once in 3 years did I ever let myself zone out.
One day, I grew careless. I let myself get really into the season finale of my favorite show. It was gripping, a fantastic story. Right at the height of the action, a young boy came up to my lounger and shook my arm. Surprised, I asked, "Who are you? How did you get in here?" He laughed and smiled brightly. "Silly, Daddy." My heart sank into my chest. I knew immediately what had happened. After a few masked questions, I discovered that he was 2 years old and that he was my son. The agony and heartache filling my chest was nearly unbearable. Not only had I missed the birth of my son, I would never see or know the first years of his life. Mar and I had obviously gotten married and started a family in the time I'd lost, and I had no idea what joys or pains those years contained. It was snowing outside. Holding my sudden son in my lap, I sat and watched the flakes fall outside. What kind of life was this going to be if slips in concentration could cost me years? I had to get help. The church had no idea what to do. The priest didn't believe me and told me I had a health issue rather than some sort of possession. The doctors didn't have any clue. Nothing showed up on all their scans and tests, but they happily took my money in return for nothing. By the time I ran out of options, I decided to tell Mar there was no way to know what this all looked like from her side. What was I like when I wasn't there? Did I still take our son to school? Did I still do my job? Clearly I did, because she seemed to be none the wiser, but I still had a horrible feeling that something must have been missing in her life when I wasn't actually home inside my own head. But the night I set up a nice dinner in preparation, she arrived, not by unlocking the front door, but by knocking on it. I answered and found that she was in a nice dress.
She was happily surprised by the settings of on the table. A fancy dinner for a second date? I knew you were sweet on me. Thank the Lord, I knew when to keep my mouth shut. If I'd gone on about being married and having a son, she might run for the hills. Instead, I took her coat and sat down for our second date. Through carefully crafted questions, I managed to deduce the truth. This really was our second date. She saw relief and happiness in me, but interpreted that as dating jitters. I was just excited to realize that the entity wasn't necessarily eating whole portions of my life. The symptoms, as I was beginning to understand them, were more like the consequences of a shattered soul. The creature had wounded me, broken me into pieces. Perhaps I was to live my life out of order, but at least I would actually get to live it. And so it went for a few years, from my perspective. While minor changes in politics or geography would happen daily, major shifts in my mental location only happened every couple of months, when I found myself in a new place and time in my life. I just shut up and listened, making sure to get the lay of the land before doing anything to avoid making mistakes. On the farthest flung leap yet, I met my 6-year-old grandson, and I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He said, writer. I told him that was a fine idea. Then, I was back in month 2 of my relationship with Mar, and I had the best night with her on the riverfront. When I say the best, I mean the best. Knowing how special she would become to me, I asked her to move in. I got to live through what I'd missed the first go-around, and I came to understand that I was never mentally absent. I would always be there, eventually. When we were moving her boxes in, she stopped for a moment and said she marveled at my great love, as if I'd known her for a lifetime and never once doubted she was the one. That was the first time I'd truly laughed freely and wholeheartedly since the entity had wounded me. She was right about my love for her, but for exactly the reason she considered a silly romantic analogy. I had known her my whole life, and I'd come to terms with my situation and found peace with it. It wasn't so bad to have sneak peeks at all the best parts ahead, but of course, I wouldn't be writing this if it hadn't gotten worse. The entity was still with me. It had not wounded me and departed like I had wanted to believe. The closest I can describe my growing understanding was that the creature was burrowing deeper into my psyche, fracturing it into smaller pieces. Instead of months between major shifts, I began having only weeks. Once I noticed that trend, I feared my ultimate fate would be to jump between times in my life, heartbeat to heartbeat. Forever confused, forever lost. Only an instant in each time meant I would never be able to speak with anyone else. Never be able to hold a conversation. Never express or receive love.
As the true depth of that fear came upon me, I sat in an older version of me and watched the snow falling outside. That was the one constant in my life. The weather didn't care who I was or what pains I had to face. Nature was always there. The falling snow was always like a little hook that kept me in a place. The pure emotional peace it brought me was like a panacea of my mental wounds, and I'd never yet shifted while watching the pattern of falling white and thinking of the times I'd gone sledding or built a snow fort as a child. A teenager touched my arm. "Grandpa?" He'd startled me out of my thoughts, so I was less careful than usual. "Who are you?" He half grinned, as if not sure whether I was joking. Handing me a stack of papers, he said, "It's my first attempt at a novel. Would you read it and tell me what you think?" Ah, of course, pursuing that dream of being a writer, I see. He burnt bright red. Trying to, anyway. Alright, run off. I'll read this now. The words were blurry and annoyed. I looked for glasses. I probably had for reading. Being older was terrible, and I wanted to leap back into a younger year, but not before I read this book. I found my glasses in a sweater pocket and began leafing through. Mar puttered in and out of the living room, still beautiful, but I had to focus. I didn't know how much time I would have there. It seemed that we had relatives over. Was it Christmas? A pair of adults and a couple kids I didn't recognize tromped through the hallway, and I saw my son, now adult, walk by me with his wife on the way out the door. As a group, the extended family began sledding outside. Finally, I finished reading the story and I called out for my grandson. He rushed down the stairs and into the living room. How was it? Well, it's terrible, I told him truthfully. But it's terrible for all the right reasons. You are still a young man, so your characters behave like young people, but the structure of the story itself is very solid. I paused. I didn't expect it to turn out to be a horror story, he nodded. It's a reflection of the times. Expectations for the future are dismal, not hopeful like they used to be. You're far too young to be aware like that, I told him. An idea occurred to me. If you're into horror, do you know anything about strange creatures? Sure, I read everything I can. I love it. Wearily, I scanned the entrances to the living room. Everyone was busy outside for the first time. I opened up to someone in my life about what I was experiencing. In hushed tones, I told him about my fragmented consciousness.
For a teenager, he took it well. You're serious? Yes. He donned the determined look of a grown man accepting a quest. I'll look into it. See what I can find out. You should start writing down everything you experience. Build some data. Maybe we can map your psychic wound. Wow. Sounds like a plan. I was surprised. That made sense, and I hadn't expected him to have a serious response. But how will I get all the notes in one place? Let's come up with somewhere for you to leave them, he said, frowning with thought. Then I'll get them, and we can trace the path you're taking through your own life, see if there's a pattern. For the first time since the situation had gotten worse, I felt hope again. How about under the stairs? Nobody ever goes under there. Sure, he turned and left the living room. I peered after him. I heard him banging around near the stairs. Finally, he returned with a box, laid it out on the carpet, and opened it up to reveal a bursting stack of papers. He exclaimed, "Holy crap!" But of course, being a teenager, he didn't really say crap. Taken aback, I blinked rapidly, forgiving his cussing because of the shock. Did I write those? He looked up at me with wonder. Yeah, or you will. You still have to write them and put them under the stairs after this. He gazed back down at the papers, then covered the box. So you probably shouldn't see what they say. That could get weird. That much I understood. Right. He gulped. There are like 50 boxes under there, all filled up like this. Deciphering these will take a very long time. His tone dropped into deadly seriousness. But I will save you, Grandpa, because I don't think anyone else can.
Tears flowed down my cheeks then, and I couldn't help but sob once or twice. I hadn't realized how lonely I'd become in my shifting prison of awareness until I finally had someone who understood. Thank you. Thank you so much. And then I was young again, and at work on a random Tuesday, once the sadness and relief faded, anger and determination replaced them. After I finished my work, I grabbed some paper and began writing. While the weeks shifted around me, while those weeks became days and then hours, I wrote every single spare moment about when and where I thought I was. I put them under the stairs, out of order. My first box was actually the 13th, and my last box was the first. Once I had over 50 boxes written from my perspective, and once my shifting became a matter of minutes, I knew it was up to my grandson to take it from there. I put my head down and stopped looking. I couldn't stand the river of changing awareness any longer. Names and places and dates and jobs and colors and people were all wrong and different. I'd never been older. I sat watching the snow fall. A man of at least 30 that I vaguely recognized entered the room. Come on, I think I finally figured it out. I was so frail that moving was painful. Are you him? Are you my grandson? Yes. He took me to a room filled with strange equipment and sat me in a rubber chair facing a large mirror twice the height of a man. The pattern finally revealed itself. How long have you worked on this? I asked him, aghast. Tell me you didn't miss your life like I'm missing mine. His expression was both stone cold and furiously resolute. It'll be worth it. He brought 2 thin metal rods close to my arm and then nodded at the mirror. Look, this shock is carefully calibrated. The electric zap from his device was starting, but not painful. In the mirror, I saw a rapid, arcing light silhouette appear above my head and shoulder. The electricity moved through the creature like a wave, briefly revealing the terrible nature of what was happening to me. A bulging leech-like mouth was wrapped around the back of my head, coming down to my eyebrows and touching each ear, and its slug-like body ran over my shoulder and into my very soul. It was a parasite, and it was feeding on my mind. My now adult grandson held my hands as I took in the horror. After a moment, he asked, removing it is going to hurt very badly. Are you up for this? Fearful, I asked, Is Mar here? His face softened. No, not for a few years now. I could tell from his reaction what had happened, but I didn't want it to be true. How? We have had this conversation a lot, he responded. Are you sure you want to know? It never makes you feel better. Tears brimmed in my eyes. Then I don't care if it hurts, or if I die. I don't want to stay in a time where she's not alive. He made a sympathetic noise of understanding and then returned to his machines to hook up several wires, diodes, and other bits of technology to my limbs and forehead. While he did so, he talked. I've worked for 2 decades to figure this out, and I've had a ton of help from other researchers of the occult. This parasite doesn't technically exist in our plane. It's one of the lesser spawns of Muzmu, and it feeds on the plexus of mind and soul and quantum consciousness, reality. When details like names and colors of objects changed, you weren't going crazy. The web of your existence was merely losing strands as the creature ate its way through you.
I didn't fully understand. I looked up in confusion as he placed a circlet of electronics like a crown on my head in an exact line with where the parasite's mouth had ringed me. What's...
Muzmu.
He paused his work and grew pale. I forgot that you wouldn't know. You're lucky, believe me. After a deep breath, he began moving again and placed his fingers near a few switches. Ready? This is carefully tuned to make your nervous system extremely unappetizing to the parasite, but it's basically electroshock therapy. I could still see Mars smile. Even though she was dead, I just been with her moments ago. Do it. The click of a switch echoed in my ears, and I almost laughed at how mild the electricity was. It didn't feel like anything, at least at first. Then I saw the mirror shaking, and my body within that image convulsing. Oh, no. It did hurt. Nothing ever had been more painful. It was just so excruciating that my mind hadn't been able to immediately process it. As my vision shook and fire burned in every nerve in my body, I could see the reflected, trembling light silhouette of the parasite on my head as it writhed in agony equal to mine. It had claws, 6 clawed, lizard-like limbs under its leech-like body, and it cut into me in an attempt to stay latched on. The electricity made my memories flare. Mars' smile was foremost, lit brightly in the front of a warm fire as the snow fell past the windows behind her. The edges of that memory began lighting up, and I realized that my life was one continuous stretch of experience. It was only the awareness of it that had been fragmented by that feasting evil on my back. I'd never managed to be there for the birth of my son. I'd jumped around it a dozen times, but never actually lived it. For the first time, I got to hold Mars' hand and be there for her. No, that moment had shifted seamlessly into holding her hand as she lay in a hospital bed for a very different reason. Not this. God, why? It was so merciless to make me remember this. I broke down into tears as nurses rushed into the room. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to experience it. I'd seen all the good parts, but I hadn't wanted the worst part. The inevitable end that all would one day face. It wasn't worth it. It was tainted. All that joy was given back 10,000-fold as pain. The fire in my body and in my brain surged to sheer white torture, and I screamed.
My scream faded into a surprised shout as the machines and electricities and chair faded away. Snow was no longer falling around my life. I was out in the woods on a bright summer day. Oh God, I turned to see the creature approaching me. It was the same absence of meaning, the same blank on reality. It crept forward, just like before, but this time it hissed and turned away. I stood, astounded at being young again, and freed from this parasite. My grandson had actually done it. He'd made me an unappetizing meal, so the predator of mind and soul had moved on in search of a different snack. I returned home in a daze, and while I was sitting there processing all that had happened, the phone rang. I looked at it in awe and sadness. I knew who it was. It was Marjorie, calling for the first time for some trivial reason she'd admit 30 years later was made up just to talk to me. But all I could see was her lying in that hospital bed dying. It was going to end in unspeakable pain and loneliness. I would become an old man, left to sit by myself in an empty house, his soulmate gone long before him. At the end of it all, the only thing I would have left sitting and watching the falling snow. But now, thanks to my grandson, I would also have my memories. It would be a wild ride no matter how it ended. On a sudden impulse, I picked up the phone with a smile and I asked, "Hey, who's this?" Even though I already knew. The end.
Nice. Before we begin our discussion, I actually just noticed that there's an author's note, so I'm going to go ahead and read it for everybody. Together, my grandfather and I did set out to write the tale of his life. Unfortunately, his Alzheimer's disease progressed rapidly, and we were never able to finish it. He's still alive, but I imagine that mentally he is in a better place than the nursing home. I like to think he's back in his younger days, living life and being happy because the reality is much colder. It's snowing today. He loves the snow. When I visited him, he didn't recognize me, but he did smile as he sat looking out the window. Which, that gave me chills.
That hurts when you look at it in a perspective like that. That is a beautiful story. That is so much better than I remembered it.
Well, not to, get off into a really sad place, but I was looking through it through this lens the whole time. And I think that's
just
unavoidable.
Adds like a realism to his like creepypasta that I'm assuming inspired this story. But it's like that was beautiful. That was amazing. That was so good. Like, there were moments I was starting to choke up a little bit towards the end, just knowing. It makes me so happy he picked up the phone, though. I'm like, he didn't decide to change the course of things, because it's like, in the end, you're still gonna have all the good stuff to experience in this life. So, but man, that was deep.
It's one of those things where it really highlights the importance of, life is painful. Life is full of suffering. But, every person in our life, every choice we make, the people we hold dear, they're so important that we would go through hell just for one more day, for one more second. And, if for some reason the author of this ever sees this in the future, present, whenever, I know what you're going through. I know what you went through. I'm going through the same thing with my father. So yeah, it hits pretty close to home for me. And I won't divulge too much into that, but I want you to know that you're not alone out there. And I really appreciate what you've done here with this story. And I think it perfectly describes what, even though my father doesn't have Alzheimer's, it's something very similar. It really does rob you of that person.
I feel like this is very, like your scenario. This story probably syncs with so many people that it connects with them even more. So it's just like, man, like I'm like shell shocked on what to say, to be honest, because man, we got a cool to get out of the deepness for a second. We did get a cool monster.
I mean,
like a leech creature.
Like I said though, that I think that's a perfect representation of what that represents as. And also the shattered, like, jumping between timelines, like where he's at in his points.
It's really
in life.
Unique, really cool.
I really think it's like that. Just from what I've observed. To everybody who's watching this, whether they've made it this far or not, and, for you two especially, and, Smite Lad, our editor, I hope and pray that none of you ever have to experience this in any form, capacity, anything, because it's the hardest thing you go through. I'm positive of it. But this is a really great way to take something so painful and make something that can touch people.
It's very beautiful and sad while at the same time still holding that fear of a creepypasta. Like it's just
Right.
written so well because you're so invested into this character being like, what is he going to do? And we get our monster, of course, but it's so much deeper than that. Like, especially that with that author's note, taking that into hand in the story and being like, the snow, like, oh my gosh, that's gorgeous. Like, man, yeah, that had me choking up towards the end. That was a lot better. Like, I remembered it being great, but I feel like maybe just reading it aloud or something just maybe made it hit with me harder.
I really like the story. It hit me real hard. So I really appreciate what he did here. Um,
What was the author's name again? Matt.
I think
Matt or Mac. Yeah, I really like this, written by Matt Dermirsky. I'll have to see if he's written anything else because, man, that punched that punched in the gut really hard. But
Some
like I was saying, there is still a kind of fun aspect. We did get a cool like little monster design. We got like a lizard like
Yeah.
leech. How many legs did he say it had?
I
Like
think it's like 4.
it was like sprouting out legs, and it's cool that when he went back in time, he went back to the day that it attached to him. So it's like he saw him and then it ran away, and it's like, oh, now it's gonna hit somebody else.
You know, I really like every aspect of it. You know, I like the fact that even if we took it as the story presents, like this was a creature that like latched onto him, I'm glad that he didn't just try to change everything to try to avoid and go a path that he didn't know. I'm glad that he, you know, wanted to experience the life that he had missed out on. I'm glad that he went with that decision instead of completely changing
Oh,
it.
if he decided not to pick up the phone, I feel like that would have just ruined the whole story.
Yeah, I think that it ruins like what it feels
Like he literally sucked up just watching his wife pass away in the hospital to picking up the phone for the first time, knowing that she's making up some story just to talk to him. It's like, that is so good. Like,
yeah. And
but this creature, I'm guessing the writer also is kind of presuming this monster to be like a physical form of dementia.
right, and you know, I'm also glad that the monster didn't die or go away, because if that is the intention, you know, we don't have a cure. We don't have a cure for that. And I like, you know, I'm gonna go ahead and say this now. You know, even if this platform never goes anywhere, like, I know if I ever came into enough money to do something, like actually do something, the one charity I'd probably invest in is like the furthering of research against Alzheimer's and dementia.
Maybe
Like,
that's something we could do in the far future.
Yeah,
if
like
we
if-
did like a charity stream.
oh yeah, I'd love to do something like that. You know, because there's countless people who have had to suffer through these kind of things, and you know, like I'm glad to see it, because you know, I've always wanted to make something out of what me and my family are going through, and so it's nice to see that someone did. You know, it's kind of it's a reassurance that you're not so alone out there in your feelings.
Yeah, while also fitting it into a really good, just like consistent story. Like, it's awesome. Just
This is a great way to show, like, to, if you have like a loved one or a friend that doesn't really necessarily understand like what it's like watching someone go through this disease, and like letting them read this, I think that that's a pretty good representation of what it's like to maybe be in their shoes.
because I liked how he was saying that he thought that at least in his dad, granddad?
The grandson is the one that saved him. So
I'm talking about the author's name.
oh, yeah, his granddad.
His granddad. It's like, he's like, I hope in his mind at least he's somewhere happy. So that kind of like, you know, insists like the jumping through times. And it's like, man, that's,
It gets even more sad if you look at how Alzheimer's and dementia works. Like, one minute you'll talk to them and they will think that you're somebody from their childhood, or you know, they are at a completely different time period than you are. And then all of a sudden there's these like 5-minute, 10-minute increments of just like pure clarity. And it's creepy to watch, because not in a bad way, but it's just like it's just, you can tell that something's not right.
Mm-hmm.
One minute they're, staring out a window and the person that you love is not there, and then all of a sudden for like a 10-minute increment they are there, and then they're gone again. It's really weird. This is the most complicated disease I've ever heard of and experienced, like seeing it. And so it's just, I really, really like the story and how it takes it and twists it and
I feel like it does put it in perspective for a lot of people, like in a processable way. To be like, it's like he put the aspect of dementia in the story, but the character, we're assuming, doesn't actually have dementia, but it explains it. It's kind of like, it goes both ways, I guess.
I like how it turns something very serious and something very real into a fantastical thing to inform, but also a fantastical thing to allow you to grieve and process, and then write your own happy ending.
Still being like a really good like science fiction kind of like time travel monster story too. So awesome.
Yeah. I mean, we could go around in circles talking about the same thing for 30 minutes, but we'll just conclude it there. If you want to read this, we're reading it on creepypasta.com. I would try to suggest finding it somewhere else because this thing is full of ads that really broke up the story for us.
Yeah.
So if you can find it somewhere else, find it somewhere else.
There's a really good reading on YouTube. I can't remember the YouTuber I watch for it, but
there might even be a link for it.
Yeah, I think there was a link, but you can find it on YouTube pretty easily. Because I didn't read it. I listened to it the first time, so.
Yeah, so we can't pull it up without causing some noise, but if you go over to creepypasta.com, they have like 2 videos linked together. I would suggest listening to those rather than trying to read it yourself.
Yeah.
But overall, good story. I think it has a great message, great idea behind it. If you ever see this one day, Matt, I applaud you. Good job.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well,
without further ado, like we mentioned at the beginning of the video, we do have an Instagram at the Horror Den channel where we post just life updates and being out and about or about to record a video. Maybe you'll get some sneak peeks on what we might be recording. We have a Patreon. Woo! Thank you to all these beautiful names. All funds of our Patreon go right back into our channel, as I'm sure you've noticed again that we both have microphones now.
Yeah, we have microphones.
We have another microphone that's for a future project we have in mind. So, just all proceeds go right back into supporting us in our very busy, work-filled lives.
And like we always say, if the funds of Patreon ever change purpose, you will all be the first people to know. Mm-hmm. Which, speaking of Patreon, we are currently in talks about some benefits to joining Patreon. So if you are a member of the channel and like right now we don't have anything on Patreon, I understand why you're not subscribing to it. But if in the future when we start announcing some things, maybe there will be something of your liking.
Or even leave some comments on like, what would you like to see on a Patreon?
Yeah, that'd be a good idea. Like, leave comments on what you would want to see there, and but you can join as low as $5 a month. So.
Yeah. If you enjoyed, just like and subscribe. Be sure to turn on notifications. I try to constantly keep engaging with all comments, and I'll do like fun polls every now and again just for funs and laughs, and I try to respond to every comment. So if you have any creepypasta recommendations, send them my way. I will definitely give them a read.
All right, guys. Well, we hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope you're enjoying all the videos coming up and we've released so far. And
next week begins Horror Havoc.
Yeah.
So be sure to stay tuned as we are about to start our Horror Havoc, our first annual Horror Havoc. We're going to be posting 2 videos a week throughout the month of October. We got some very, very fun movies lined up. Creepypastas too, but we got some fun stuff lined up that we think y'all are going to enjoy. A little bit of everything.
Yeah, nothing too huge.
More fun.
Yeah, more fun. We're
Halloween season.
Yeah, we're taking a more fun approach this time around. Maybe one day in the future we can cover some really big hitters, but we're going to save those. But all right, guys. Well, I hope you're enjoying all the videos and keeping up to date, and I hope you're excited for Halloween as we are, and I hope you're ready for Horror Havoc here at the Horror Den. And more importantly than anything else,
Stay spooky out there.